the night of March 15th, 1988, 13 people were eliminated across Detroit's east side in what would become known as the Washington Revenge Killings. All adults, all members or associates of the 7 Mile Blood Street Gang. The method was calculated. Drive-by shootings executed with military precision. Victims hunted down at trap houses and street corners. Bodies left in alleys and abandoned buildings as warnings to anyone who thought burning down a family's business came without consequences. The perpetrators weren't rival gang members fighting over drug territory or police conducting raids on organized crime. They were 4 brothers from the Washington family, avenging what they believed was an unprovoked attack on their livelihood with violence that shocked a city already hardened to crack epidemic warfare and daily murder. The Detroit Police Department would later call it the deadliest single-night retaliation in the city's gang war history. But the motive wasn't about drugs, wasn't about territory disputes, wasn't even about disrespect in the traditional sense. It was about an auto body shop burned to the ground on March 8th, 1988, destroying $240,000 in equipment and killing the Washington brothers' father, who'd been working late, and 4 sons' absolute conviction that the gang responsible deserved systematic elimination according to street codes that valued blood for blood above any law. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Detroit sprawled across 139 square miles in southeastern Michigan in 1988, a city hemorrhaging population and economic vitality, down from 1.8 million residents in 1950 to barely 1 million, with vast sections of the east side abandoned to decay and crime. The landscape was urban devastation. Burned-out buildings from the 1967 riots still standing as monuments to collapse, empty lots where homes had been razed, entire neighborhoods reduced to wasteland. March in Detroit meant temperatures struggling into the 40s during the day, dropping to the 20s at night. Dirty snow piled in parking lots, the kind of cold that settled into bones and never quite left. The air smelled like diesel from trucks on a 94. Wood smoke from barrel fires where homeless people tried to stay warm, and the acrid tang of crack cocaine being cooked in abandoned houses across neighborhoods where law and order had ceased to exist. At night, you could hear the entire east side settling into violence. Gunshots so common nobody called police anymore. Sirens wailing toward scenes officers wouldn't reach for 30 minutes. The distant thump of music from trap houses where drugs sold 24 hours daily. This was Detroit in 1988, a war zone where crack had destroyed communities, where gangs controlled territory more effectively than city government, where life was cheap and death was constant. But 1988 was the peak year of Detroit's crack epidemic, the absolute nadir of a city's collapse into violence and despair. The drug had arrived in 1985, had spread like cancer through neighborhoods already weakened by factory closures and white flight, had created an economy more powerful than anything legal Detroit offered. Crack sold for $5 to $20 per rock was instantly addictive, generated profits so enormous the teenagers with 9th grade educations were earning $5,000 weekly working corners. The money attracted gangs, transformed loose affiliations into organized criminal enterprises controlling specific territories. enforcing rules through violence that made 1920s prohibition look restrained. By 1988, Detroit was averaging 680 murders annually, mostly young black men killing each other over corners and disrespect and perceived slights that would have been resolved through fistfights a decade earlier. The 7 Mile Bloods controlled territory along 7 Mile Road on the east side, ran a dozen trap houses, employed maybe 200 people from runners to enforcers, grossed an estimated $2 million monthly selling crack. They weren't the largest gang in Detroit, weren't the most violent, but they were ruthless about protecting territory and eliminating anyone they perceived as threats to their operation. The gang's leader was a man named Marcus Brick Johnson, 28 years old, who'd grown up on 7 Mile, who'd transformed from high school athlete into crack kingpin when General Motors closed the plant where his father had worked for 30 years, who saw drug dealing as capitalism practiced honestly in a city where honest work meant poverty. The Washington family had lived on the East Side since 1945, when James Washington Sr. had migrated from Alabama seeking factory work that actually existed then, that paid middle-class wages, that built a community of black homeowners and small business operators. 3 generations of Washingtons had worked auto plants, had owned homes, had believed in the promise that hard work led to prosperity. That promise had died with factory closures in the 1970s and 1980s, had been cremated by crack in the mid-1980s, but James Washington Sr. had adapted, had opened an auto body shop in 1982, had built a legitimate business, serving a community that still needed cars repaired, even if they couldn't afford new ones. By 1988, Washington Auto Body employed 15 people, generated $400,000 annually, represented everything James Sr. believed about building through honest labor instead of quick money from drugs. The shop sat on Harper Avenue, 3 blocks from 7 Mile territory, had operated peacefully for 6 years, had never had problems with gangs who generally left legitimate businesses alone because destroying them served no purpose. That changed in March 1988 when the 7 Mile Bloods decided the Washington shop occupied space they wanted for a new trap house, when they made an offer to buy the property that James Sr. refused, when they decided that refusal required a response that would demonstrate what happened to people who didn't cooperate with gang authority. James Robert Washington Sr. was 62 years old that March. Though decades of factory work and running a business in a dying city had aged him beyond his years, he stood 6'0", built lean and hard, with the kind of wiriness that came from constant vigilance and never quite relaxing. His face was angular, with dark eyes that rarely showed emotion but somehow communicated everything he was thinking. He kept his hair cut military short, face clean-shaven, moved with precision that came from Marine Corps training in 1968, from 13 months in Da Nang, where he'd learned to kill efficiently and live with it afterwards. He'd come home in 1970, had tried factory work at Ford's Rouge plant, lasted 3 years before the nightmares and flashbacks made regular employment impossible. He'd bounced between jobs for a decade before his father offered him work at the body shop in 1982, gave him structure and purpose that kept him functional. Marcus was methodical, patient, the brother who thought 5 steps ahead, who'd learned in Vietnam that successful operations required planning and discipline and understanding your enemy better than they understood themselves. When the 7 Mile Bloods made their move on his father's shop, Marcus was the one who started gathering intelligence, learning their patterns, identifying vulnerabilities, preparing for the war he knew was coming. Terrell Anthony Washington was 35, same height as Marcus, but built heavier, stockier, with a quiet intensity that made people uncomfortable. He had the Washington features, the angular face, the dark eyes. But where Marcus was controlled and calculating, Terrell was patient to the point of stillness. The brother who could sit motionless for hours, watching, listening, processing information. He'd worked at General Motors' Cadillac plant from 1973 to 1982, had watched automation and overseas competition eliminate jobs, had taken his small severance to help his father expand the body shop. Terrell handled the business side, managed accounts, dealt with insurance companies, maintained the legitimate paperwork that kept the shop operating legally. He'd married young at 22, had 3 children, had watched his neighborhood transform into a war zone while trying to raise kids with values that seemed increasingly irrelevant. His wife had left him in 1986, taken the children to Atlanta, said she couldn't watch them grow up in Detroit's violence. That abandonment had hardened Terrell, had made him angrier, had created readiness for violence that had been building for years. Deshaun Michael Washington was 32, built thick and powerful, with a barrel chest and arms like tree trunks. He had the same features but darker coloring, more intensity in his eyes that suggested barely controlled rage. Deshaun had always been the fighter, the brother who solved problems with fists, whose temper had led to the assault conviction in 1980, who'd spent 2 years in Jackson, learning that violence was currency in systems where nothing else mattered. He'd come out in 1982, harder, meaner, more willing to cross lines his brothers hesitated at. He worked at the shop doing heavy body work that required strength more than skill. Spent evenings lifting weights in his basement, preparing for violence he knew would eventually come. On March 8, 1988, at 2:47 a.m., Washington Auto Body burned. The fire started in 3 separate locations simultaneously. Gasoline accelerant, used to ensure maximum damage. Flames spreading so rapidly that by the time Detroit Fire Department arrived, 12 minutes later the building was fully engulfed. Firefighters found James Washington Sr.'s body in his office, trapped by flames, dead from smoke inhalation before the fire consumed him. He'd been working late on a restoration project, a 1965 Mustang that belonged to a retired teacher who'd saved for 2 years to afford the work. James Sr. had stayed past midnight detailing the engine, had probably never heard the 7 Mile Bloods members breaking windows and splashing gasoline, had died doing what he'd always done. Honest work in a city that punished honesty. By 4 a.m., the shop was a smoking shell. $240,000 in equipment destroyed, 6 decades of family history reduced to ash and twisted metal. Marcus got the call at 4:23 a.m. from a Detroit Fire Department arson investigator, drove to the scene, stood watching smoke rise from ruins, understood immediately what had happened and why. The 7 Mile Bloods had sent their message, had demonstrated what happened to people who refused to cooperate, had killed his father to prove a point about power and territory and the new rules that govern Detroit's streets. By 8 a.m. on March 8th, all 4 Washington brothers had gathered at Marcus's house, sitting in stunned silence, processing loss and rage, and understanding that their father had been murdered over property, over gang territory, over refusal to sell out to criminals who destroyed their neighborhood. The Detroit Police Department had opened an arson investigation, had confirmed 3 separate points of origin, had classified it as suspected gang retaliation. But the detective assigned the case had been honest about prospects. We know it was probably the 7 Mile Bloods, detective had said. But proving it's different from knowing it, we'll investigate. But without witnesses or physical evidence tying specific individuals to the arson, prosecution's unlikely. Your father's death will probably be ruled murder, but nobody will go to prison for it. This is Detroit in 1988. We got 680 murders a year, most unsolved. I'm sorry, but that's reality. Marcus had listened, thanked the detective, understood that legal justice was unavailable, that the system couldn't or wouldn't protect them, that avenging their father required methods outside any law. That evening, Marcus gathered his brothers. Dad's dead because he wouldn't sell to gangbangers, Marcus said. Police won't help us. Courts won't touch it. The people who killed him will walk away laughing. So we have 2 choices. Accept that our father's murder goes unpunished, or we handle it ourselves. Street style, Detroit style, the way things actually get settled when law fails. The 4 Washington brothers stood in the ruins of their father's shop on March 9th, one day after the fire, surrounded by charred equipment and ash that represented everything their family had built. Marcus had brought them here deliberately, wanted them to see the destruction, to smell the smoke, to stand where their father had died, to feel the rage that would sustain them through what came next. This is what they did to us, Marcus said. Burned our father alive, destroyed our business, sent a message that they run this neighborhood, and we're nothing. Police won't help. Law won't help. So we do this ourselves. We eliminate the 7 Mile Bloods systematically. We make them understand that killing a Washington has consequences. Terrell spoke carefully. Marcus, you're talking about gang warfare. We're not gangbangers, we're mechanics. We don't have the organization, the weapons, the experience. The Bloods got 200 members, got automatic weapons, got territory they'll defend. We're 4 men with hunting rifles and righteous anger. That's suicide. Marcus shook his head. The Bloods got numbers, but we got advantages they don't. I got combat experience from Vietnam. Know tactics. Know how to plan operations. We got the element of surprise because they think we're scared civilians who will accept this. We got knowledge of the neighborhood, know where they operate, where they're vulnerable. Most importantly, we got nothing left to lose. They took our father, our business, our future. What's left except revenge? Deshaun was ready immediately. I'm in. Been waiting my whole life for permission to hurt people who deserve it. The Bloods destroyed our neighborhood, got our people addicted to crack, killed Dad for refusing to participate. They deserve everything we give them. Antoine struggled visibly, youngest brother torn between loyalty and sanity. Y'all talking about murder, multiple murders. Even if we succeed, even if we eliminate gang members, we're going to prison for life. We throw away our futures to avenge Dad's death? Marcus met his youngest brother's eyes. What futures, Antoine? Dad's shop is gone, burned to nothing. Jobs in Detroit don't exist for brothers like us. Legal economy's dead, replaced by crack and violence. We're already destroyed, already got nothing. Only question is whether we go down quiet or whether we make the people who destroyed us pay a price they'll remember. The four brothers stood there in ash and ruins, making a decision that would end 13 lives and destroy their own, choosing blood for blood according to street codes that had governed Detroit's violence since crack arrived, understanding that legal justice was a myth sold to people who believed systems still worked. Terrell finally nodded. For Dad, for what they took from us. We do this smart, we do it clean, we make sure they know why they're dying. Marcus pulled out a map of Detroit's east side, marked with locations he'd been gathering for 2 days. 7 Mile Blood's trap houses, corners where they sold, places where gang members congregated. We start planning. We hit the March 15th, 1 week after they killed Dad. We make that date mean something they'll never forget. The preparation took 6 days, from March 9th to March 15th, methodical and careful. Marcus applying military training to planning an assault on gang territory. They met every evening at Marcus's house in a neighborhood 3 miles from 7 Mile. Far enough the Bloods wouldn't notice, close enough to maintain surveillance on targets. Marcus had served as a rifleman in the Marines, had learned small unit tactics, understood how to coordinate fire, how to use terrain and surprise to overcome numerical superiority. Vietnam had taught him that successful operations required intelligence gathering, careful planning, understanding enemy patterns, and exploiting vulnerabilities. He applied those lessons to Detroit streets, treating the 7 Mile Bloods like Viet Cong, studying their movements, identifying soft targets, planning strikes that would maximize casualties while minimizing exposure. The arsenal was assembled from family collections and street purchases made carefully to avoid attention. Marcus owned a Colt AR-15 semi-automatic rifle he'd bought legally in 1985. Civilian version of the M16 he'd carried in Vietnam, chambered in .223 Remington. Terrell had a Mossberg 500 shotgun, 12 gauge, devastating at close range. Deshaun owned a Ruger Mini 14 semi-automatic rifle in .223, lightweight and fast-firing. Antoine had their father's old Remington 870 shotgun. They also acquired 2 handguns through street contacts, a 9mm Beretta and a .45 Colt 1911, plus ammunition purchased from different stores across 3 counties. Total firepower: 4 rifles, 3 shotguns, 2 handguns, enough for sustained engagement if things went wrong. Marcus planned the operation like a military campaign, identified 13 specific targets across 5 locations, all verified 7 Mile Bloods members or associates who worked the drug operation. The primary target was Marcus, quote, 3. Johnson, the gang's leader, who Marcus had confirmed through surveillance, gave the order to burn the shop. Secondary targets included Brick's lieutenants, the enforcers who actually set the fire, the trap house managers who profited from crack sales in the neighborhood. Marcus created a timeline. They'd start at 9 p.m. on March 15th, hit 5 locations in sequence, eliminate targets systematically, complete the operation by midnight, be home before Detroit police could coordinate response. Each brother had specific assignments. Marcus would take the AR-15, handle long-range engagements, provide overwatch. Terrell would drive, navigate routes, ensure they could move quickly between locations. Deshaun would handle close quarters work with his Mini 14, the enforcer who'd execute targets at point-blank range. Antoine would provide backup with the shotgun, cover exits, prevent anyone from escaping. They rehearsed the routes, timed each segment, identified escape paths, if things went wrong. By March 14th, they were ready, had transformed from grieving sons into a kill team, preparing to wage war on a street gang that had destroyed their family. That evening, Marcus gathered his brothers one final time. Tomorrow we make them pay for Dad. 13 targets, 5 locations, 3 hours. We move fast, we shoot straight, we don't hesitate. Anyone who runs, we hunt down. Anyone who surrenders, we eliminate anyway. No witnesses, no mercy, no exceptions. This is war. And in war, you destroy your enemy completely or you lose. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees by the time the Washington brothers loaded weapons into Terrell's 1985 Chevy Caprice, a nondescript sedan that wouldn't draw attention in neighborhoods where drug dealers drove Cadillacs and BMWs. Detroit's east side was alive with activity despite the cold, trap houses operating 24 hours, corners busy with transactions, the crack economy running at full capacity. Marcus sat in the passenger seat, AR-15 across his lap, watching streets he'd known his entire life, seeing them transformed into war zones where young men his sons' ages sold poison and killed each other over territory worth nothing beyond immediate profit. Deshaun and Antoine sat in the back, weapons ready, faces showing combination of determination and fear that Marcus recognized from Vietnam, the expression soldiers wore before first combat. Terrell drove in silence, following the route they'd rehearsed, heading toward the first target, a trap house on Gratiot Avenue where Brick Johnson held court most evenings, where the gang's leadership congregated, where eliminating multiple high-value targets would decapitate the 7 Mile Bloods command structure. Marcus had confirmed through surveillance that Brick would be there tonight, had watched the patterns for 6 days, understood the gang's routines better than they understood themselves. At 9 p.m. exactly, Terrell pulled the Caprice to the curb half a block from the trap house, a burned-out building that looked abandoned but showed lights and windows, people moving inside, luxury vehicles parked out front, advertising the wealth crack generated. Marcus studied the scene through binoculars. 4 cars outside, probably 8 to 10 people inside. Brick's Cadillac is here, that's confirmed. We do this fast, simultaneous entry through front and back, maximum violence. Don't give them time to grab weapons or organize resistance. Deshaun, you take the back door with Antoine. Terrell and I go through the front. Shoot anyone armed, anyone who moves toward weapons, anyone who runs. We're looking for Brick specifically, but we eliminate everyone we can. The 4 brothers exited the Caprice, split into 2 teams, approached the trap house from different directions. Marcus could hear music inside, voices laughing, normal sounds of people who had no idea 4 armed men were about to breach their doors and execute them. He thought about his father burning to death in his shop, thought about 6 decades of honest work destroyed by gangbangers who contributed nothing except addiction and violence, thought about the detective who'd said justice was unlikely. Marcus raised his AR-15, looked at Terrell, counted down silently with his fingers. 3, 2, 1. They kicked the front door simultaneously, breaching front and back, flooding into a room where 7 Mile Bloods members sat around a table counting money, bagging crack, conducting business with weapons visible but not ready. The surprise was total, the confusion absolute. Marcus opened fire immediately. AR-15 on semi-automatic, controlled pairs the way Marines trained, center mass shots, professional execution. Terrell's Mossberg roared, buckshot devastating at 15 feet. From the back, Deshawn's Mini 14 cracked repeatedly, Antoine's shotgun adding to the thunder. The trap house became a slaughterhouse. The shooting lasted maybe 20 seconds, felt like hours. Muzzle flashes brilliant in the dim trap house, cordite smoke filling the room. Brass casings raining on floor already slick with blood. Marcus moved through the space with mechanical efficiency, double-tapping anyone still moving, clearing the room the way he'd cleared Vietnamese villages. Muscle memory, taking over conscious thought. 7 bodies, some dead instantly, others dying. One trying to crawl toward a pistol on the table. Marcus shooting him twice more. Terrell stood by the door, Mossberg smoking, face showing shock at what they'd just done, at how quickly human beings could be reduced to meat and bone. From the back room, Deshawn emerged, Mini 14 still raised. 2 more back there, both down. That's 9 total. Where's Brick? Marcus scanned the bodies, recognized gang members from surveillance photos, saw lieutenants and enforcers, but not the leader. Brick's Cadillac is outside, but he's not here. Must have stepped out, probably at another location. We need to move before someone reports the shooting. They exited the trap house at 9:04 p.m. 4 minutes after breach, 9 7 Mile Bloods members dead inside. The Washington brothers already moving toward their second target. Behind them, the trap house stood silent except for music still playing, bodies cooling. The first scene in what would become Detroit's deadliest single night of gang violence. Terrell drove toward the second location, hands shaking on the steering wheel, breath coming fast. We just killed 9 people, Terrell said. Shot them like it was nothing. Like they were targets instead of human beings. They were targets, Deshawn said from the back seat. They destroyed our family. They got exactly what they deserved. Marcus stayed quiet, checking his AR-15's magazine, confirming he had rounds remaining, preparing for the next engagement. In Vietnam, he'd killed dozens of people, had stopped counting after the first year, had learned to disconnect from the moral weight of taking lives. Tonight felt different somehow, felt personal in ways combat never had. Felt like he was crossing lines he'd managed to avoid even in war. But his father was dead, burned alive by people who thought violence solved everything. And if that's how they wanted to play it, Marcus would show them what real violence looked like when practiced by someone with actual training. The second target was a corner on Harper Avenue, a 24-hour drug market where 3 7 Mile Bloods members sold crack from a bus shelter, where customers lined up like it was a legitimate business, where the gang made $10,000 nightly, in a neighborhood where legal economy had completely collapsed. Marcus had identified the 3 workers, knew their names, knew they worked for Brick, knew they'd been part of the operation that destroyed his father's shop, even if they hadn't personally set the fire. Terrell pulled the Caprice to the curb at 9:17 p.m., idling 50 feet from the bus shelter where 3 young men, none older than 22, sold crack to customers who looked like zombies, hollowed out by addiction, desperate for next hit. Marcus rolled down the passenger window, raised his AR-15, sighted through the scope on the first seller. A kid maybe 20 years old, wearing a Detroit Pistons jacket, counting money from a transaction. Marcus thought about hesitating, thought about the fact that this was a child barely out of high school, thought about how the drug war and economic collapse had created situations where teenagers sold poison because no other options existed. Then he thought about his father dying in flames, pulled the trigger 3 times, watched the kid drop. The other 2 sellers scattered, running in opposite directions, one toward an alley, one toward a nearby abandoned building. Deshawn and Antoine exited the Caprice, pursued on foot, rifles ready. Marcus heard shots, Deshawn's Mini 14 barking twice, then Antoine's shotgun roaring once. Silence. Deshawn's voice on the radio Marcus had distributed. 2 more down. That's 12 total. 1 more to go to make 13. The Washington brothers regrouped at the Caprice, drove away from the corner where 3 bodies lay, where customers had scattered like cockroaches when lights came on, where the 24-hour drug market had been permanently closed through violence the city couldn't or wouldn't apply through law. Terrell was crying now, driving through tears, understanding that they'd murdered children, that righteous rage didn't change the mathematics of what they were doing. Marcus, we killed kids. That last one couldn't have been 20. What are we becoming? We're becoming what Detroit made us, Marcus said. What the Bloods made us when they killed Dad. You want to stop? Say so now. We'll go home, we'll accept that we only got 12 of the 13 we promised ourselves. Terrell kept driving. The 3rd location was a house on East Warren where Brick Johnson's girlfriend lived, where intelligence suggested Brick might be hiding after the Gratiot Avenue massacre, where eliminating him would complete the mission and send the message Marcus wanted to send. At 9:43 p.m. they arrived, parked down the block, studied the house. Lights on inside, Brick's Cadillac in the driveway, confirmation that the primary target was present. Marcus made the decision. We breach like before, front and back, simultaneously, eliminate everyone inside, make sure Brick doesn't escape. They approached the house, split into teams, Marcus and Terrell taking the front, Deshawn and Antoine covering the back. At 9:47 p.m. they kicked both doors, flooded into a living room where Marcus Brick Johnson sat on a couch watching television, his girlfriend beside him, both turning toward the sound of breaking doors, both understanding too late what was happening. Marcus raised his AR-15, looked at the man who'd ordered his father killed, who'd built wealth selling crack to his own community, who'd destroyed neighborhoods for profit. Brick raised his hands, started to speak, probably to beg or negotiate or threaten. Marcus didn't let him finish. Fired 4 rounds center mass. Watched the gang leader fall backward over the couch, dead before he hit the floor. The girlfriend screamed, tried to run. Antoine's shotgun roared once. She dropped. Antoine stood frozen, shotgun still raised, staring at the woman he'd just killed. A young woman, maybe 25 years old, who'd been watching television with her boyfriend, who died because she was present when the Washington brothers came for vengeance. Antoine had never killed anyone, had never even fired a weapon at a person, had just executed someone who wasn't even a gang member, who was guilty only of dating the wrong man. He dropped the shotgun, backed against the wall, slid down to sitting position, put his face in his hands. I killed her, Antoine whispered. She wasn't armed, wasn't threatening us, was just sitting there. I murdered an innocent woman. Deshawn picked up Antoine's shotgun, checked the body. She knew Brick, lived with him, benefited from drug money. She's not innocent. Besides, she saw us. What were we supposed to do, leave a witness? Marcus stood over Brick's body, feeling nothing, empty where satisfaction should be, understanding that killing the man responsible for his father's death didn't change anything, didn't bring his father back, didn't restore their shop, didn't undo the damage. 13 bodies now. the number they'd promised themselves, mission complete, revenge extracted, and Marcus felt only exhaustion and recognition that they'd become exactly what they'd been fighting against. People who solved problems through murder, who valued vengeance over law, who destroyed lives to settle scores. They left the house at 9:52 p.m., returned to the Caprice, drove through Detroit streets in silence. 4 brothers who'd crossed lines they could never uncross, who'd killed 13 people in less than an hour, who'd transformed from mechanics into mass murderers over a week of rage and planning. Terrell drove aimlessly, not heading home, not heading anywhere specific, just driving through the wasteland Detroit had become, past abandoned buildings and burned lots and corners where dealers sold, despite 13 of their associates being dead. The drug economy continuing regardless of violence, because demand never stopped, because poverty and addiction created markets that couldn't be eliminated through killing. Marcus stared out the window, seeing his reflection in glass, seeing his father's face instead of his own, wondering what James Washington Sr. would think about his son's revenge, whether he'd approve or be horrified, whether he'd understand that legal justice was unavailable, so they'd taken the only justice Detroit still offered. At 11:47 p.m., Terrell finally drove to Marcus's house, parked in the driveway, 4 brothers sitting in the Caprice, surrounded by weapons and spent brass, understanding that their lives as they'd known them were over, that they'd either be arrested or killed in retaliation, that the cycle of violence they'd perpetuated wouldn't end with 13 deaths, but would continue escalating until everyone involved was destroyed. "We did what we had to do," Marcus said. "For Dad, for our family, for showing the Bloods that burning our shop had consequences. You all did good, stayed disciplined, completed the mission. Now we wait to see what comes next." The first 911 call came at 9:06 p.m. from a neighbor who heard gunfire at the Gratiot Avenue Trap House, reported what sounded like automatic weapons, people screaming. The second call came at 9:19 p.m. from Harper Avenue, witnesses reporting a drive-by shooting at a bus shelter, multiple people down. The third call came at 9:49 p.m. from East Warren, woman screaming that someone broke into her neighbor's house and started shooting. By 10 p.m., Detroit Police Department understood they had a coordinated attack on 7 Mile Bloods territory, multiple scenes, casualties mounting, the largest single gang-related incident in the city's recent history. By midnight, when crime scene investigators had access to all 3 primary locations, plus the Harper Avenue corner, the body count stood at 13. 9 at the Gratiot Trap House, 3 on Harper, 2 at the East Warren House, including Marcus. Quote 5. Johnson. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Williams, 44 years old, 22 years with Detroit PD, stood at the Gratiot scene looking at 9 bodies scattered around a table still covered with crack, cocaine, and cash, understanding this was execution, not combat. Systematic elimination of gang members by people who knew what they were doing. The shooting pattern suggested military training, controlled fire, professional tactics. Shell casings recovered were .223 Remington and 12 gauge, common calibers but suggesting rifles and shotguns, suggesting people with resources and planning. By 2 a.m. on March 16th, Detroit PD had connected the attacks, had understood all 13 victims were 7 Mile Bloods members or associates, had identified the common factor. All worked for or were connected to Marcus, quote 6, Johnson's operation. The motive wasn't immediately clear until a detective remembered the Washington auto body arson from March 8th. Remembered that James Washington Sr. had died in that fire. Remembered that fire investigators suspected 7 Mile Blood's involvement. Remembered that Washington had refused to sell his property to Brick Johnson. Lieutenant Williams pulled the file, read the arson report, understood immediately what had happened and why. This is revenge, Williams told her team at 3 a.m. James Washington's 4 sons just went to war against the gang that killed their father. We're looking for Marcus, Terrell, Deshaun, and Antoine Washington, Vietnam veteran, mechanic, ex-convict, and college dropout. 4 civilians who just eliminated 13 gang members in coordinated strikes across our jurisdiction. They're armed, they're organized, and they just demonstrated they're willing to commit mass murder. We find them before the Bloods do, or we'll have a full gang war that'll make tonight look restrained. By dawn on March 16th, Detroit police had issued warrants for all 4 Washington brothers. 13 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, felony firearm. The manhunt began as the sun rose over a city where 13 more young men had died in violence that never stopped, that consumed generation after generation, that turned brothers into killers and neighborhoods into graveyards. The Washington brothers sat in Marcus's living room on the morning of March 16th, watching local news report the massacre they'd committed, seeing aerial footage of crime scenes, hearing reporters describe it as the deadliest gang retaliation in Detroit history, listening to police spokesmen confirm 13 deaths and announce warrants for their arrest. Antoine was still in shock, hadn't spoken since killing Brick's girlfriend, just sat staring at nothing, processing the reality that he'd murdered an innocent woman. That righteous revenge had transformed him into something he didn't recognize. Terrell kept his hands pressed together like he was praying, though he hadn't prayed since his wife left, hadn't believed God paid attention to Detroit since crack arrived and destroyed everything. Deshaun showed no remorse, seemed satisfied, kept saying they'd done what needed doing. That 13 dead bloods was justice for one dead father. Marcus felt empty, hollowed out, understanding that killing Brick Johnson hadn't brought satisfaction or closure, had just added weight to guilt he'd been carrying since Vietnam, had proven that violence solved nothing except creating more violence. At 9 a.m., Marcus's phone rang. He answered, heard Lieutenant Williams's voice. Marcus Washington, this is Detroit Police. We know what you and your brothers did last night. We know why. We understand your father was murdered and you wanted justice the law couldn't provide. But you killed 13 people. You need to surrender before this gets worse. Marcus considered the offer, considered turning themselves in, accepting life sentences, ending this before the 7 Mile Blood's organized retaliation. Then he thought about Detroit's criminal justice system, about how it had failed to prosecute the gang members who'd burned his father alive, about how surrendering meant life in prison for avenging a murder police wouldn't solve. We're not surrendering, Marcus said. You want us, you come get us. But you know what'll happen if we resist. Williams's voice stayed calm. Marcus, I served too. Army, Desert Storm. I understand about brothers, about codes, about doing what you think is right when systems fail, but this isn't war. This is Detroit. You can't win against the entire police department and the Bloods. You surrender now, you live. You run, you force our hand, and you die. Marcus hung up. He looked at his brothers. Police want us to surrender. I told them no. We did what we set out to do, got revenge for Dad, sent the message we wanted to send. Now we have choices: surrender and spend life in prison, run and probably get killed, or go down fighting. What do y'all want to do? Terrell spoke first, voice tired. I want to surrender. We killed 13 people, Marcus. That's enough blood. We made our point. Time to accept consequences. Antoine nodded, still not fully present. I can't run, can't live with what I did. Rather face prison than keep running from that woman's face. Deshawn disagreed. We surrender. We're admitting what we did was wrong. I ain't admitting that. The Bloods killed our father. We killed them back. That's how it works on these streets. We don't apologize for that, don't surrender for that. By noon on March 16th, Detroit police had surrounded Marcus's house with overwhelming force. 40 officers, SWAT team in full tactical gear, helicopters overhead, armored vehicles blocking streets. The entire neighborhood evacuated. Lieutenant Williams used a bullhorn from behind an armored car. Marcus Washington, you and your brothers have 30 minutes to surrender. Come out unarmed, hands visible, and no one gets hurt. We know you're veterans, we know you're armed, we know you can make this a bloodbath. But it ends the same way regardless. You in custody, or you dead. Choose wisely. Inside the house, the four brothers made their final decisions. Marcus had accepted that fighting police was suicide, that they'd accomplished what they'd set out to do, that dying here served no purpose. Terrell and Antoine agreed, were ready to surrender, to accept consequences for murders they could no longer justify even to themselves. Deshawn refused, said he'd rather die than spend life in prison, rather go out fighting than submit to a system that had failed them at every turn. The brothers argued for 20 minutes, Deshawn finally accepting that 3 against 1 meant surrender was happening whether he agreed or not. At 12:28 p.m., Marcus walked out of his house, hands raised, unarmed. Behind him came Terrell, Antoine, and Deshawn, all surrendering without resistance. No final shootout, no martyrdom, no blaze of glory. Just 4 brothers accepting consequences for 13 murders committed in rage and grief, and misguided belief that violence delivered justice. Police swarmed them, forced them to the ground, handcuffed them, read them rights they'd violated spectacularly. Lieutenant Williams stood over Marcus. You killed 13 people in one night, Williams said. Most were gang members who probably deserved it by any moral standard. But 3 were kids, barely out of high school. 1 was a woman who just happened to be in the wrong place. You crossed lines, Marcus. You became what you were fighting against. Marcus met her eyes. They burned my father alive. System wouldn't help us, wouldn't prosecute them, wouldn't deliver justice. We took the only justice Detroit still offers, blood for blood. Williams shook her head. No, you took revenge. Justice and revenge aren't the same thing. Justice would have been working with us, building a case, getting convictions. Revenge was killing 13 people and destroying 4 more lives. As police loaded the Washington brothers into separate vehicles, news cameras captured everything, broadcast it live. The image of 4 black men in handcuffs, becoming another Detroit story about violence begetting violence, about how crack and poverty and systemic failure created conditions where ordinary people transformed into killers, about a city where death was so common it barely registered unless the body count reached double digits. The Washington brothers had joined a long list of Detroit men destroyed by circumstances they couldn't control and choices they couldn't take back. their father's death avenged at the cost of everything they'd been trying to protect. The trial of Marcus, Terrell, Deshaun, and Antoine Washington began in September 1988 in Wayne County Circuit Court in downtown Detroit. The venue stayed local because defense attorneys argued the brothers deserved to be judged by people who understood East Side poverty, crack epidemic violence, and systematic failure of institutions meant to protect communities. 52 combined charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy, felony, firearm possession. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence. Eyewitness testimony from survivors at the Harper Avenue corner. Ballistic evidence linking Washington family weapons to bullets recovered from bodies. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses showing the caprice at crime scenes, and most damning partial confessions from Terrell and Antoine, who'd broken under interrogation, admitted participation, expressed remorse. The evidence was so overwhelming that conviction seemed inevitable from opening statements. The defense, 4 court-appointed attorneys, led by a prominent Detroit civil rights lawyer named Thomas Reed, attempted to argue extreme emotional disturbance brought on by their father's murder and police failure to prosecute the arson. They painted a picture of desperate men driven to violence by grief and systemic injustice, men who'd exhausted legal options before resorting to street justice. They brought in psychologists who testified about PTSD from Vietnam affecting Marcus's judgment, about how watching his father burn to death created temporary insanity, about how grief combined with rage produced actions the brothers wouldn't have taken under normal circumstances. The prosecution destroyed these arguments systematically. Assistant Wayne County Prosecutor Jennifer Hart was 39 years old, had prosecuted gang violence cases for 12 years, specialized in dismantling sympathetic narratives killers constructed. Grief doesn't justify 13 murders, Hart told the jury during closing arguments. These defendants had legal options. They could have worked with police, could have pressured prosecutors, could have filed civil suits, could have pursued justice through legitimate channels. They chose execution instead. They planned for a week, gathered weapons, identified targets, coordinated military-style assaults on multiple locations. They shot teenagers selling drugs to survive in an economy that offered no legal alternatives. They killed a young woman who wasn't even a gang member. They hunted people through streets like animals. This isn't temporary insanity brought on by grief. This is premeditated mass murder motivated by revenge. The jury, 12 Detroit residents who understood East Side violence but drew lines between understandable rage and actual murder, deliberated for 31 hours over 4 days. When they returned, the verdict was split. Marcus Washington, guilty of 13 counts of first-degree murder. Terrell Washington, guilty of 12 counts, acquitted of killing Brick's girlfriend due to reasonable doubt about who fired that shot. Deshaun Washington, guilty of 13 counts. Antoine Washington, guilty of 12 counts. Same acquittal as Terrell. The verdicts reflected jury understanding that while all 4 participated, degrees of culpability varied, that Antoine's remorse and cooperation mattered, that some moral distinctions existed even in Massacre. Sentencing came in November 1988. Judge Thomas Carter, 61 years old, 18 years on the bench, looked at the 4 Washington brothers with something between sympathy and horror. "Your father's murder was wrong," Judge Carter said. The 7 Mile Bloods should have been prosecuted, should have faced justice for arson and murder. That failure of our system is real, is documented, is part of what drove you to this. But you killed 13 people. You hunted them systematically. You showed no mercy even to those who weren't directly responsible for your father's death. Marcus Washington, you organized this operation, applied military training to mass murder, life without possibility of parole. Terrell Washington, you participated fully, drove the vehicle, provided crucial support. Life without parole. Deshaun Washington, you showed no remorse, expressed satisfaction in killing. Life without parole. Antoine Washington, you showed genuine remorse, cooperated with investigators, demonstrated understanding of the gravity of your actions. 60 years, eligible for parole after 40. The sentences reflected the reality that 13 deaths demanded severe punishment regardless of motive, that revenge killings couldn't be tolerated even when initial murder went unprosecuted, that systemic failure didn't excuse individual violence. Marcus accepted his sentence without reaction, had known since pulling the first trigger that life was over, that prison or death were the only possible outcomes. Terrell wept, finally breaking under the weight of what they'd done, understanding that he'd thrown away his future to avenge a father who would have wanted them to live, not to kill. Deshaun showed defiance, maintained he'd done right, that the Bloods deserved everything they got, that he had no regrets. Marcus Washington remains incarcerated at Kinross Correctional Facility in Michigan's Upper Peninsula at age 74. He served 36 years, will die in prison, has spent decades trying to reconcile military service with mass murder, trying to understand where defending his country ended and becoming a killer began. In a 2019 interview, Marcus said, "I killed 13 people to avenge my father. In Vietnam, I killed more than that following orders. Difference is one was legal and one wasn't. But the dead are equally dead. I don't know what that means about justice or morality. I just know I've spent 36 years in a cage thinking about it." Terrell Washington died in prison in 2003, age 50, of complications from diabetes that went untreated due to inadequate prison health care. He'd written letters to victims' families every year, apologizing, trying to explain, seeking forgiveness most never granted. Deshaun Washington died in prison in 2011, age 55, killed during a riot at Ionia Maximum Correctional Facility. Went down fighting like he'd always said he would. Died believing he'd done right, even when everyone else said he was wrong. Antoine Washington was paroled in 2028 after serving 40 years. Age 69, works at a Detroit community center teaching young men about consequences of violence, about how revenge solves nothing, about how 13 deaths didn't bring his father back, didn't restore their shop, didn't accomplish anything except destroying everyone involved. The 13 7 Mile Bloods members who died left behind 21 children, 11 mothers, dozens of family members whose lives were shattered by one night of revenge killing. The victims' families scattered across Detroit and beyond, some staying on the east side, most leaving to escape memories and ongoing violence that didn't stop with 13 deaths, but continued as new gangs filled the vacuum the Bloods left behind. Marcus Brick Johnson's mother, Dorothy Johnson, raised his 3 children alone, struggled with poverty and grief, died in 2001, believing her son had been murdered unjustly, unable to see how his drug dealing had destroyed the same community she'd tried to build. The girlfriend who died with Brick Tamika Williams, was 24 years old, had a 2-year-old daughter who grew up without her mother, raised by grandparents who blamed both the Bloods and the Washingtons, understood that cycles of violence consumed everyone regardless of who started it. The 3 teenagers killed on Harper Avenue had been supporting families through drug sales, had seen no legal alternatives in a city where youth unemployment exceeded 50%, where high school diplomas meant nothing, when factories had closed and legitimate economy had collapsed. Their deaths left mothers without income, siblings without providers, families plunged into poverty deeper than what they'd already known. Some victims' families sought revenge, talked about retaliating against the Washington family, about continuing the cycle. Others chose different paths, became activists against gang violence, worked with community organizations trying to break patterns that had destroyed Detroit's black neighborhoods since crack arrived in 1985. Washington Auto Body's ruins sat abandoned for 3 years after James Sr.'s death, a burned shell that became a memorial where people left flowers and notes, where the community mourned not just one man but the entire idea that honest work could succeed in Detroit's wasteland. The property was eventually sold to a developer who built a gas station, erasing the last physical evidence that the Washington family had built something legitimate, that 3 generations had believed in creating through labor instead of taking through violence. The East Side neighborhood where the Washingtons had lived for 43 years, emptied out through the 1990s and 2000s, houses abandoned as people fled violence and poverty, entire blocks razed by the city. The community James Sr. had known and loved ceasing to exist in any meaningful way. By 2024, the area where Washington Auto Body stood is mostly empty lots and a few remaining houses occupied by people too poor to leave. The neighborhood, a monument to everything Detroit lost when auto industry collapsed and crack epidemic arrived and violence became the primary way disputes were settled. The Washington family name, once respected for honest work and community contribution, became synonymous with mass murder, with revenge killing, with how grief and rage could transform ordinary men into killers when systems failed and legal justice was unavailable. 36 years have passed since that March night in Detroit. The Washington family legacy, 3 generations of honest labor and belief in building through legitimate work, died with James Sr. in flames and with his sons in prison cells. The auto body shop they killed 13 people to avenge is gone, replaced by a gas station where customers pump fuel unaware of the blood spilled over that ground. The revenge they extracted didn't resurrect their father, didn't restore their business, didn't accomplish anything except adding 13 more bodies to Detroit's endless count, destroying 4 more lives in process. The uncomfortable truth is that the Washington brothers were right about one thing. The legal system failed them completely, wouldn't prosecute the arson that killed their father, wouldn't deliver justice through legitimate channels, left them with only street justice as an option. But being right about systemic failure didn't justify 13 murders, didn't transform execution of gang members into righteous defense, didn't make hunting teenagers through Detroit streets into honorable revenge. Marcus crossed lines he'd learned to navigate in Vietnam, applied military training to mass murder, convinced his brothers that violence delivered what law couldn't. The system that failed the Washingtons failed the Bloods too, created conditions where young black men sold crack because factories had closed and legal economy offered nothing, where gangs provided structure and income that legitimate society wouldn't, where violence became currency in neighborhoods abandoned by every institution meant to protect them. 13 people died because poverty and crack and systemic racism created desperate conditions on all sides, because James Washington Sr. wouldn't sell to gangsters who thought violence solved everything, because Marcus Washington believed avenging his father required blood for blood. There's no satisfying conclusion, no justice that resurrects the dead or redeems the killers, just blood and questions, and families destroyed in a city where violence consumed generation after generation, where honest work couldn't compete with drug money, where systems failed so completely that ordinary people became murderers and neighborhoods became graveyards. 36 years later, Detroit is slowly recovering, population stabilizing, some neighborhoods rebuilding. But the east side where this happened remains largely abandoned, a wasteland of empty blocks and memories of when 500,000 black people lived there, believing in futures that never materialized. The Washington brothers' story is one of thousands in Detroit, variations on the same theme of violence begetting violence, of systems failing and people taking justice into their own hands, of how poverty and racism and economic collapse created conditions where mass murder seemed like reasonable response to injustice. Marcus remains in prison, will die there, carries weight of 13 deaths that didn't change anything except proving that revenge solves nothing. The fire that killed his father consumed everything: the shop, the family, the neighborhood, the belief that honest work mattered in a city where only violence spoke loudly enough to be heard.